For nearly a decade, young women vanished along California's Interstate 5. No witnesses, no dramatic crime scenes, just silence stretching across miles of dark highway. Until investigators discovered that the predator hiding in plain sight wasn't a drifter or a trucker, but a quiet Sacramento businessman whose own upholstery fibers became the microscopic thread that unraveled his carefully controlled double life, exposing the man the media would call the I-5 Strangler, and whose story would end decades later inside a prison cell in a twist as chilling as the crimes themselves. Chapter 1. A Quiet Man in Sacramento. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Sacramento was a city in transition. California's capital was growing outward, its highways stretching like arteries across farmland and suburban developments. Interstate 5 carried travelers north and south, a restless ribbon of asphalt connecting small towns, truck stops, and quiet communities that rarely imagined themselves part of something darker. The nights along I-5 were often still, illuminated only by headlights and the distant hum of engines fading into the distance that it was here, in this unassuming landscape, that Roger Kibbe lived a life that seemed ordinary from the outside. Born in 1939, Roger Kibby grew up in California during an era defined by post-war optimism and suburban expansion. He was not a drifter. He was not a shadowy figure living on the margins of society. He held steady employment. He married. He had children. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared structured, disciplined, perhaps even a little reserved. The kind of man you might pass at a hardware store without a second thought. That be why the time he settled into Sacramento, Kibbe had established himself as a businessman. He operated a furniture upholstery shop, a trade that required patience, precision, and attention to detail. Fabric, stitching, tools, and patterns were part of his everyday routine. Those who interacted with him described someone methodical, sometimes quiet, sometimes stern, but not extraordinary in any obvious way. His life seemed built on routine, but history has shown, time and again, that routine can conceal complexity. The late 1970s were turbulent years across California. Economic pressures, social change, and rising crime rates created unease in many urban areas. Yet, even amid that atmosphere, few could have imagined that a pattern was beginning to form along Interstate 5. The disappearances were scattered at first, isolated, seemingly unrelated. Young women would vanish. Some were hitchhiking. Some were navigating difficult personal circumstances. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their last known locations often traced back to stretches of highway, rest stops, or roadside areas that seemed insignificant on any map. And because they came from different backgrounds, different cities, and different walks of life, it took time before investigators began to sense a connection. Sacramento in those years was not yet gripped by widespread panic. There were no flashing headlines declaring a serial predator on the loose. Instead, there were fragments, missing persons reports filed quietly, families waiting for phone calls that never came, detectives reviewing sparse evidence with limited forensic technology compared to today's standards. Meanwhile, Roger Kibbe continued his life that he worked. He drove. He moved through the same highway systems that would later define his nickname, the I-5 Strangler. But that title did not exist yet. At the time, there was no unified identity attached to the crimes. There was only uncertainty. What made Kibbe particularly difficult to suspect was his ability to blend into ordinary spaces. He was not living a transient lifestyle. He was embedded in a community. He paid bills. He interacted with customers. He maintained the outward framework of a stable adult life. In hindsight, investigators would later examine this duality. the stark contrast between his public persona and the pattern emerging along California's highways. But in the beginning, there were only questions. Law enforcement agencies across different jurisdictions faced an immediate obstacle: communication. In the pre-digital era, police departments did not share databases the way they do today. A disappearance in one county might not automatically trigger alerts in another. Patterns that would now be detected through data analysis remained obscured by geography and paperwork, and Interstate 5 stretched for miles. The highway itself became an almost symbolic presence in the unfolding mystery. Long, dimly lit segments of road. Agricultural land giving way to rest areas. Truck stops where drivers came and went without leaving much trace. For someone intent on anonymity, the environment offered opportunity, yet opportunity alone does not create a pattern. It requires intent. Those who later studied Kibbe's movements observed that his business gave him legitimate reasons to travel. He could explain long drives. He could account for hours spent on the road. Upholstery work sometimes required materials or deliveries. A man in his profession driving along I-5 did not appear unusual. This normalcy became his shield. But behind that shield, something darker was unfolding, something that would take years to piece together. And what made it particularly chilling was not spectacle, but subtlety. There were no dramatic public confrontations, no brazen daylight acts that drew immediate attention. Instead, there were quiet disappearances that accumulated slowly, like pieces of a puzzle investigators did not yet realize they were assembling. As months turned into years, whispers began to circulate within certain law enforcement circles. Detectives compared notes informally. Similarities surfaced: geographic proximity to I-5, similar victim profiles, similar disposal locations. But without direct evidence tying these cases together, the theory of a single perpetrator remained just that, a theory. Roger Kibbe remained in the background. Friends and family saw him as disciplined, sometimes rigid. Some described him as strict. Others mentioned that he valued control and order. These traits, innocuous on their own, would later take on new meaning when viewed through a forensic lens. The psychology of individuals who lead double lives often reveals a compartmentalization, an ability to separate one identity from another. Experts would later analyze how someone could attend family gatherings, run a business, and simultaneously engage in calculated criminal behavior. The answer is rarely simple. It often involves long-standing behavioral patterns, internal rationalizations, and an absence of empathy that remains hidden until exposed by circumstance. But in the early stages of this case, exposure had not yet occurred. The communities along Interstate 5 still slept under quiet skies. Truck headlights still passed in steady rhythm. The upholstery shop still opened its doors. And Roger Kibbe still moved through Sacramento as if he were just another citizen among thousands. The danger was not loud. The late evenings in Sacramento often carried a stillness that felt almost deceptive. Streetlights cast pale halos across residential sidewalks. The hum of distant traffic drifted in and out like a mechanical lullaby. In neighborhoods not far from the central corridors of the city, houses stood neatly arranged, their windows dark by midnight. It was within this calm framework that Roger Kibbe's life continued undisturbed. The outside world. There was nothing theatrical about him. He did not project flamboyance or aggression. His demeanor, according to later accounts, leaned toward reserved and methodical. In his upholstery business, he was known for precision. Stitching had to be straight. Measurements had to be exact. Materials had to align perfectly. It was a craft built on control, shaping fabric to fit a structure, tightening surfaces until they conformed to expectation. Control would become an important word in understanding the years that followed. By the early 1980s, missing persons reports connected to the I-5 corridor had begun to quietly accumulate. Investigators in different counties were working their cases independently, unaware that fragments of a larger pattern were forming. Some victims were young women navigating unstable circumstances. Others had been hitchhiking, a practice still relatively common at the time despite growing warnings. Interstate 5 was both a lifeline and a vulnerability, a path of opportunity for travelers and, as it would later become clear, for someone seeking anonymity that in Sacramento. However, daily life went on. Customers visited Kibby's shop. Orders were completed. Conversations happened about fabric samples and furniture frames. He presented himself as structured, responsible, sometimes even rigid in his expectations. There were no outward signs that would immediately place him under suspicion. What often complicates investigations into serial offenses is the absence of dramatic escalation at the beginning. Instead, there are gaps, unexplained absences that can be attributed to countless possibilities. Voluntary disappearance, relocation, personal crises. In the era before widespread surveillance cameras, digital footprints, and instant database sharing, tracing someone's final movements required far more manual effort. The geography of California also worked against swift conclusions. The distance between cities along Interstate 5 is considerable. Jurisdictional boundaries divided responsibility. A case in one county did not automatically merge with another unless someone recognized the similarities. And even when similarities were noticed, proving a single perpetrator required more than instinct. Meanwhile, Kibby's movements blended seamlessly into the flow of traffic. He drove the same roads that truckers, commuters, and families traveled daily. The anonymity of the highway offered both concealment and opportunity. Long stretches without witnesses, areas where vehicles could pull over briefly without attracting attention. The infrastructure itself, designed for efficiency, inadvertently created isolation. Psychological experts would later examine the possibility that Kibby's outwardly structured life masked deeper compulsions. Individuals who maintain rigid public routines sometimes use that structure as a stabilizing framework, while compartmentalizing behavior that contradicts their external identity. The human mind, particularly when driven by distorted impulses, can construct elaborate rationalizations. But during those early years, no psychological profile had been attached to a suspect. There was no composite sketch circulating across news channels. Instead, families waited. Detectives revisited files, and scattered pieces of evidence sat in storage rooms, preserved but not yet unified. The first significant suspicions did not immediately point toward Kibbe. In fact, it would take years before law enforcement began narrowing their focus toward him. The absence of obvious connections between victims slowed progress. Without eyewitnesses placing a single individual at multiple scenes, investigators were forced to rely on physical traces, fibers, tool marks, patterns of movement, subtle indicators that required time and technological advancement to interpret properly. The irony of Kibby's profession would later become striking. Upholstery work involves specialized tools and materials, cutting instruments, binding materials, fabric remnants. In isolation, these items are ordinary. In context, they would take on evidentiary weight. Yet at this stage of the narrative, none of that had been publicly revealed. Sacramento did not yet associate the name Roger Kibbe with fear. The term I-5 Strangler had not yet entered headlines. Instead, there was only an undercurrent of unease beginning to ripple among certain law enforcement circles. Detectives compared timelines. They mapped last seen locations. Interstate 5 appeared repeatedly in their notes. Still, suspicion is not proof. The years between the first disappearances and Kibby's eventual identification as a suspect were marked by incremental realization. It was a process of connecting fragments rather than discovering a single dramatic clue. And this incremental nature makes the case particularly compelling in hindsight. It demonstrates how patterns can remain invisible until viewed from the right angle. Friends and acquaintances of Kibbe would later describe moments that, in retrospect, felt unusual: strictness, rigidity, a preference for control in domestic environments. But these impressions only gained meaning after the broader truth emerged. At the time, they were simply personality traits. One of the most haunting aspects of cases like this is the normalcy that surrounds them. A person can operate within society, attend gatherings, conduct business, and participate in everyday conversations while concealing actions that contradict every outward appearance. This duality creates a psychological tension that investigators must eventually untangle. As the 1980s progressed, advances in forensic science slowly improved investigative capabilities. Fiber analysis, for instance, became more refined. Laboratories developed more reliable methods of comparing materials. These advancements would later prove pivotal, but for now, the story remains in its early, quiet phase. The highway continued to carry its steady flow of vehicles. Sacramento continued to grow. The upholstery shop remained open, and Roger Kibbe maintained the rhythm of a man whose life appeared entirely predictable. The predictability was an illusion, and somewhere along Interstate 5, the pieces of a case were waiting to be assembled. Chapter 2: The Disappearances Along Interstate 5. Interstate 5 is more than a highway. It is a spine that runs the length of California, connecting border towns to farmland, major cities to isolated rest stops, and ordinary routines to the vast anonymity of the open road. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, it carried a constant current of movement: truck drivers on long hauls, families relocating, hitchhikers seeking opportunity, and workers commuting between counties. By day, it shimmered under the California sun. By night, it became something quieter, more solitary, illuminated only by headlights and distant taillights fading into darkness. It was along this corridor that a troubling pattern began to form. At first, the disappearances seemed unconnected. A young woman missing from one county, another vanishing days or weeks later from a different stretch of road. Some had been last seen hitchhiking. Others were navigating unstable situations, traveling between cities, or attempting to reach new destinations. In isolation, each case was tragic but not necessarily linked to a broader design. Law enforcement agencies approached each disappearance with urgency, but also with limitations. The late 1970s lacked the integrated databases that modern investigators rely on today. There was no instant cross-county digital comparison of forensic evidence. Reports were filed on paper. Communication required phone calls, memos, and personal connections between detectives. Patterns, when they existed, were slow to emerge. Families waited for answers. What complicated these early investigations was the nature of Interstate 5 itself. The highway cuts through agricultural areas, stretches of open land, and industrial zones where visibility can be limited. Rest stops offer brief moments of refuge, but they also create opportunities for anonymity. A vehicle can pull over without drawing attention. A driver can engage in conversation with a traveler without anyone noticing. In an era before widespread surveillance cameras, such encounters often left little trace. Some victims were described as vulnerable, navigating difficult personal circumstances. Others were simply passing through. Their lives, backgrounds, and social circles differed enough that connecting them required more than surface-level comparison. Yet detectives began to notice subtle similarities. last known locations near the I-5 corridor, timelines that suggested brief encounters, and evidence that hinted at a controlled, deliberate offender. The word pattern began to surface quietly in investigative discussions that IT was not yet public knowledge. There were no front-page headlines announcing a serial predator. But within certain departments, investigators started mapping cases across counties. Pins on physical maps marked where victims were last seen. Lines traced the highway. Over time, those pins formed a narrow band along Interstate 5. This geographical consistency raised questions. Who would have legitimate reasons to travel repeatedly along this corridor? Who could move between counties without arousing suspicion? The highway was busy, but not everyone drove its length regularly. Commercial drivers, sales representatives, delivery workers. These professions offered plausible explanations for long-distance travel. Roger Kibbe fit into this landscape without standing out as an upholstery business owner. He had reason to transport materials or meet clients. Driving did not appear unusual for him. The rhythm of the road blended into his daily routine. Yet at this stage of the investigation, his name was not widely associated with the disappearances. The pattern was still abstract, lacking a focal point. Detectives faced additional obstacles. Some victims had complex personal histories. In certain cases, initial assumptions leaned toward voluntary disappearance or transit movement. It is a tragic reality that when individuals from vulnerable backgrounds go missing, their cases sometimes receive less immediate urgency than others. This delay can allow critical time to pass, but the emerging similarities persisted. Investigators began examining timelines more closely. Several disappearances occurred within a relatively concentrated geographic area. The victims were often encountered in environments connected to travel, on-ramps, rest areas, roadside locations. There were indications of a methodical approach, though specifics remained guarded within investigative files. Forensic science at the time was evolving. Fiber analysis, for example, was gaining recognition as a valuable tool. Small traces could link a suspect to a location or victim if properly preserved. However, such breakthroughs required meticulous laboratory work and, often, comparison samples that were not immediately available. Meanwhile, the communities along Interstate 5 remained largely unaware of the potential connection tying these cases together. News coverage addressed individual disappearances, but without definitive proof of a serial offender. Public warnings remained general rather than specific. The absence of public panic may have contributed to the offender's ability to continue undetected. There is a particular tension in cases like this, a sense that the truth exists just beyond reach. Detectives reviewing files might sense alignment in the evidence, yet lack the definitive link needed to consolidate cases officially. Each new disappearance added weight to the theory, but also pressure. The longer the pattern continued without identification, the more complex the investigation became. By the early 1980s, internal discussions among certain investigators began shifting from isolated cases to the possibility of a single perpetrator operating along Interstate 5. The profile emerging was of someone organized, mobile, and cautious. Someone who selected victims in transitional environments where witnesses were minimal. Someone who understood geography well enough to exploit it. This was not impulsive chaos that IT suggested planning. And planning implies patience. The highway, once simply a symbol of movement and opportunity, was gradually becoming associated with something darker in investigative circles. Yet without a name or face attached, the theory remained incomplete. The disappearances continued to echo across counties, leaving families in uncertainty and detectives in pursuit of clarity. And somewhere within the steady flow of traffic along I-5, a driver blended into the night. indistinguishable from the thousands of others sharing the road. The pieces were there. They simply had not yet been assembled. By the early 1980s, the tone within certain California law enforcement circles had begun to shift. What had once been treated as isolated disappearances were now being viewed through a wider lens. Detectives in different counties, some separated by hours of driving time, were starting to compare notes more deliberately. Patterns were no longer whispers. They were emerging frameworks. Interstate 5 ran like a central thread through nearly every case under review. When investigators laid out timelines side by side, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Victims had last been seen near on-ramps, rest stops, or transitional roadside areas connected to the highway. In several cases, there were indications of brief encounters rather than prolonged interactions. The offender, whoever he was, appeared to be selecting locations that maximized isolation while minimizing risk. The geography was strategic. I-5 cuts through long agricultural stretches in northern and central California. In certain areas, especially at night, visibility is limited and traffic can thin dramatically. A vehicle stopping briefly along the shoulder might not attract attention. A driver offering a ride to someone attempting to travel north or south could do so without raising alarms. In that era, hitchhiking had not yet completely faded from common practice. Despite increasing caution from authorities, this environment created opportunity, and the offenders seemed to understand it intimately. Investigators also began to examine behavioral patterns. The emerging profile suggested someone organized and controlled. There were no signs of chaotic scenes or impulsive acts that left obvious trails. Instead, evidence hinted at deliberate planning and calculated execution. This was not random violence spilling into public view. It was controlled, quiet, and methodical. As forensic labs processed materials from various scenes, subtle consistencies began to surface. Fibers, tool marks, unusual binding materials. None of these elements alone confirmed a single perpetrator, but together they formed a mosaic of possibility. Fiber analysis, though still developing as a forensic discipline at the time, became a critical focus. Microscopic strands could link disparate events if traced correctly. Yet the challenge remained. Investigators needed a suspect. During this period, Roger Kibbe continued living what appeared to be an ordinary life in Sacramento. He maintained his upholstery business. He interacted with customers. He drove regularly, sometimes for business-related purposes. Nothing in his daily routine outwardly signaled that he was connected to the growing pattern along I-5. The difficulty in cases involving organized offenders is their ability to compartmentalize. A person can present one identity to family, colleagues, and neighbors while maintaining an entirely separate set of behaviors elsewhere. This duality complicates suspicion. Without direct evidence, there is little to justify intrusive investigation into someone who outwardly appears stable. Meanwhile, public awareness remained limited. News coverage addressed individual cases but did not yet declare the presence of a serial predator operating along the interstate. The absence of a unifying narrative meant that travelers continued to move along I-5 without a heightened sense of danger. Rest stops remained active. Hitchhikers still stood at on-ramps with signs indicating their destinations. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were growing increasingly concerned. Mapping software did not exist in the way it does today. Detectives relied on physical maps pinned to office walls. Each marker represented a life interrupted. Over time, the visual pattern became stark, a narrow vertical band tracing the highway corridor. The statistical likelihood of coincidence began to diminish. There were discussions about the offender's familiarity with the region. He appeared comfortable navigating between counties. He seemed aware of areas where visibility was low and response times might be slower. Such knowledge suggested someone local or someone whose occupation required regular travel. The possibility that the offender was embedded within the community, rather than an outsider passing through, introduced a chilling dimension. It implied that he could be interacting daily with unsuspecting individuals, maintaining relationships, and conducting business while concealing his actions. As months progressed, the urgency intensified. Each new disappearance risked reinforcing the pattern. Investigators revisited earlier cases, looking for overlooked connections. Evidence storage rooms were reopened. Items were re-examined with updated forensic techniques. What once seemed insignificant now carried potential meaning. One of the most critical elements in serial investigations is patience. Offenders who operate over extended periods often believe their methods are flawless. That confidence can lead to repetition, repeating routes, repeating techniques, repeating environments. Repetition creates consistency, and consistency creates vulnerability. At this stage, law enforcement had not yet identified Roger Kibbe as the focal suspect, but the groundwork was being laid. The highway had become the central axis of the investigation. The offender's mobility, control, and apparent comfort with long-distance travel were defining characteristics. Interstate 5 itself seemed to transform in perception. What had once symbolized connection and commerce now carried a quiet undercurrent of suspicion. Travelers could not see it. Most never knew it. But within investigative circles, the highway had become synonymous with an unfolding mystery. And somewhere within Sacramento's ordinary neighborhoods, a man continued his daily routines. A businessman, a driver, a resident whose name had not yet entered public discourse. The disappearances were no longer isolated tragedies. They were forming a story that was moving steadily toward revelation. Chapter 3: Patterns in the Shadows. By the mid-1980s, the theory that a single offender was operating along Interstate 5 had grown stronger within investigative circles. What once felt like a loose alignment of tragic coincidences was now being examined as something far more deliberate. Detectives revisited timelines, studied case files in greater detail, and compared forensic reports with renewed intensity. Slowly, the shadows between the cases began to thin. Patterns are rarely dramatic when they first appear. They emerge quietly, through repetition. A similar last known location, a comparable victim profile, a consistent geographic radius. In this case, the repetition was subtle but persistent. Several victims had been encountered in transitional environments, areas where anonymity thrives. The offender seemed to favor circumstances where brief interactions could occur without drawing attention. Investigators began constructing a behavioral outline. The offender likely possessed patience. He likely understood the rhythm of the highway, when traffic ebbed, when rest stops emptied, when certain stretches grew particularly isolated. He appeared organized rather than impulsive. There were indications of preparation, suggesting that encounters were not random acts of sudden aggression, but part of a calculated routine. This distinction mattered. Organized offenders often blend seamlessly into society. They maintain employment. They build routines that offer plausible explanations for travel or absence. They take steps to avoid leaving obvious evidence. They compartmentalize their actions, separating personal life from criminal behavior with startling precision. As detectives refined their working profile, they considered occupations that might align with the pattern. Truck drivers were initially examined, given their frequent use of Interstate 5. Sales representatives and delivery workers also came under scrutiny. Anyone with legitimate reason to traverse multiple counties became a potential candidate. Roger Kibbe, still did not occupy the center of suspicion. Yet in retrospect, his life aligned in troubling ways with the developing profile. As a business owner in Sacramento, he had flexibility. He controlled his schedule. His work with upholstery required tools and materials that, in isolation, were entirely benign. But context has a way of transforming ordinary objects into investigative focal points. Forensic science was advancing, albeit slowly compared to modern standards. Fiber analysis gained increasing attention. When microscopic strands were recovered in multiple cases, analysts worked to determine their origin. The process required meticulous comparison under microscopes, examining color, weave, and composition. While not definitive on its own, fiber consistency across cases strengthened the argument for a single offender. Detectives also noted an element of ritualistic consistency. The method suggested control, not chaos. Control over environment. Control over interaction. Control over timing. Such behavioral repetition can reveal psychological underpinnings. Experts would later describe the importance of dominance and planning in organized serial cases. These offenders often derive psychological reinforcement from maintaining authority within carefully constructed scenarios. Yet the offender's confidence was also his vulnerability. The longer a pattern continues, the greater the chance of leaving behind a trace. No system is flawless. No routine remains perfect indefinitely. Investigators understood that patience would be critical. Rather than waiting for a dramatic mistake, they focused on building incremental connections. Meanwhile, Sacramento remained largely unaware of the evolving theory. There were no widespread alerts naming a suspect. Public life continued. Interstate 5 remained active, its steady flow of vehicles masking the investigation unfolding behind closed doors. Inside law enforcement offices, however, tension mounted. Detectives began sharing more information across jurisdictions. Meetings were scheduled to discuss similarities. Case files were physically transported between counties. This collaboration marked a turning point. The highway was no longer simply a backdrop. It was central to the investigative framework. Victimology became another key focus. Understanding who the offender selected and why offered insight into his decision-making process. Several victims were encountered while traveling or seeking rides. This suggested the offender may have been comfortable initiating contact under the guise of assistance. A vehicle becomes a private space once doors close, separating occupants from outside view. The highway environment provided plausible explanations for brief stops. The emerging psychological portrait was of someone controlled, deliberate, and mobile. Someone who did not attract attention in daily life. Someone whose outward routine concealed calculated movement. Roger Kibbe's life continued in parallel that he maintained relationships. He operated his upholstery shop. To those around him, he remained a figure defined more by strictness than by suspicion. If there were warning signs, they were subtle, behaviors that, in isolation, would not trigger alarm. But patterns do not exist only in geography. They exist in time. As investigators compared case intervals, they noticed spacing that suggested restraint. The offender did not act in rapid succession. There were pauses, periods where no disappearances occurred that matched the pattern. This restraint indicated discipline. It suggested someone capable of waiting, perhaps balancing criminal impulses with maintaining external stability. Such control can be deceptive. It creates the illusion of randomness when, in fact, there is calculated timing behind it. By the late 1980s, pressure intensified to identify a suspect. Advances in forensic comparison increased the potential for breakthroughs. Laboratories revisited earlier evidence with improved techniques. Items once considered marginal gained renewed significance. The shadows were narrowing. And although Roger Kibby's name had not yet become synonymous with the I-5 corridor, the investigative net was tightening, slowly, methodically, and with growing certainty that the pattern was real. The highway still hummed at night. But now, detectives were listening more closely. As the investigation matured, detectives shifted from simply identifying similarities to actively testing them. It was no longer enough to suspect a pattern. They needed to stress it, challenge it, and determine whether it could withstand scrutiny. If the theory of a single organized offender operating along Interstate 5 was accurate, then the details should align consistently across cases. This stage of investigation is often painstaking. Files are reopened. Evidence is cataloged again. Timelines are reconstructed hour by hour. Small discrepancies are examined with as much care as obvious overlaps. In the I-5 corridor cases, investigators began overlaying travel routes, estimating how long it would take a single driver to move between key locations tied to disappearances. The distances were workable. The intervals were plausible. The theory held. Another element began to crystallize. The offender appeared comfortable initiating contact. There were indications that victims entered a vehicle voluntarily, suggesting the initial interaction did not immediately trigger alarm. This detail reinforced the organized profile. The offender likely presented himself as non-threatening, perhaps even helpful. Confidence and composure can be powerful tools in gaining trust during brief roadside encounters. The psychological dimension deepened. Experts consulted on similar cases often emphasize the role of compartmentalization. An organized offender can sustain dual identities for years by maintaining rigid separation between public life and private behavior. In Roger Kibby's case, the emerging profile began to mirror aspects of his lifestyle. He was structured. He valued order. He maintained routine. These characteristics, though outwardly neutral, aligned disturbingly well with the discipline implied by the crimes. For investigators, however, alignment was not enough. They needed evidence that could survive courtroom scrutiny. Fiber analysis continued to play a pivotal role. In several cases, fibers recovered from victims or associated environments shared similarities. Analysts worked carefully to compare weave patterns and material composition. Upholstery fibers, in particular, drew attention due to their distinct manufacturing characteristics. The possibility that specialized materials were involved narrowed the pool of potential sources. This detail would later become one of the investigation's most critical turning points. Meanwhile, law enforcement began discreetly reviewing individuals whose occupations involved upholstery or fabric handling. Sacramento, as a growing city, housed multiple small businesses of this type. Roger Kibby's name surfaced among them, not as a prime suspect initially, but as part of a broader review. When investigators quietly examined his background, they found no immediate criminal record that would raise alarm. He was a family man, a business owner, stable. Yet stability, in cases involving organized offenders, does not equate to innocence. It can instead provide the very cover that allows long-term offending to continue undetected. Surveillance, when initiated, had to be subtle. Any overt action risked alerting a potentially cautious individual. Detectives understood that if their theory was correct, the offender was disciplined and attentive. One misstep in the investigation could compromise months of progress as evidence accumulated. Confidence grew internally that the pattern pointed toward a single individual. The geographic clustering along Interstate 5, the behavioral consistency, and the forensic indicators were converging. Still, investigators moved deliberately. Serial cases demand precision. Premature conclusions can unravel under legal scrutiny. Publicly, there was still no widespread naming of a suspect. The term I-5 Strangler began circulating more frequently in media coverage as connections between cases were acknowledged, but the identity behind that title remained uncertain. The nickname reflected geography more than personality, a shorthand for a predator operating along the highway's spine. For those working the case, the nickname carried weight. It symbolized years of unresolved disappearances and mounting pressure. Each family waiting for answers amplified the urgency. As the late 1980s approached, advances in forensic science were accelerating. Laboratories improved comparison methods. The possibility of tying fibers to specific sources became increasingly realistic. What had once been circumstantial could now edge closer to definitive. In Sacramento, Roger Kibbe's routines continued. Customers entered and exited his upholstery shop. Fabric samples were cut. Tools were stored neatly. To anyone observing casually, it was a portrait of normalcy. But investigators were beginning to look more closely. The net around the I-5 Strangler was tightening, not through dramatic confrontations or sudden breakthroughs, but through cumulative analysis. Every map overlay, every lab report, every cross-county meeting added another thread. And those threads were starting to converge toward a single focal point. The shadows were no longer as dense as they once were. Soon, the investigation would move from pattern recognition to direct confrontation. But at this moment, it remained a quiet pursuit, deliberate, patient, and guided by the belief that even the most disciplined routine leaves traces behind. Chapter 4: A Community on Edge. By the late 1980s, something subtle but undeniable had shifted across portions of Northern California. What had once been isolated news reports were now being referenced together. Conversations that had previously centered on individual tragedies began to include a new, uneasy phrase: a predator along Interstate 5. The term I-5 Strangler started appearing more frequently in regional media, not as sensationalism, but as acknowledgement of a growing pattern that authorities could no longer ignore. Sacramento, though not gripped by visible panic, carried an undercurrent of unease. Highways are built to symbolize movement and freedom. Interstate 5 had long represented economic lifelines and travel opportunities. But now, for some residents, it also represented uncertainty. Families with loved ones who traveled frequently became more cautious. Hitchhiking, once a fading but still practiced method of travel, declined sharply as warnings intensified. Rest stops that had once felt mundane acquired a different atmosphere after dark. Law enforcement agencies were navigating a delicate balance. They needed public awareness, but they also needed to avoid triggering widespread hysteria without definitive identification of a suspect. Statements to the press were measured. Officials emphasized caution while continuing to withhold specific investigative details. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Serial investigations carry unique weight. Each unresolved case compounds the urgency of the next. Detectives working the I-5 corridor cases were acutely aware that time was not a neutral factor. The longer the offender remained unidentified, the more difficult it became to reconstruct earlier events. Witness memories faded. Physical evidence degraded. Leads cooled. In Sacramento, Roger Kibbe continued operating his upholstery business with apparent normalcy. Customers described him as methodical. Some recalled him as stern or exacting in his standards. He maintained order in his workspace, tools arranged precisely, materials organized by type and color. Such habits, in isolation, might be interpreted as professional discipline. Yet investigators reviewing his background would later note how closely this rigidity mirrored the structured pattern they had attributed to the offender. Still, at this stage, suspicion had not crystallized into accusation. The broader community's awareness of a serial predator created behavioral shifts. Women traveling alone became more cautious about accepting rides. Law enforcement increased patrol visibility along certain stretches of the highway. Public service announcements reminded residents of safety precautions. Yet the highway remained vast, its length spanning hundreds of miles across varying terrain. One of the most unsettling aspects for investigators was the offender's apparent adaptability. The spacing between incidents suggested someone capable of restraint. There were intervals where no confirmed disappearances occurred that fit the established pattern. These pauses created uncertainty. Had the offender relocated? Had he stopped? Or was he simply waiting? Waiting implies control, and control had become the defining theme of the case. In communities along I-5, rumors circulated. Some speculated that the perpetrator might be a truck driver. Others theorized that he could be an outsider passing through from another state. Few imagined that he might be an established local businessman living quietly within Sacramento's residential grid. This gap between perception and reality is often what allows organized offenders to operate undetected for extended periods. When danger is imagined as distant or transient, suspicion rarely falls on someone embedded within familiar social structures. Investigators, however, were beginning to narrow their focus. Fiber analysis had grown increasingly persuasive. The presence of upholstery-related materials in multiple cases could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Detectives discreetly compiled lists of local upholstery businesses and individuals with access to specialized fabrics and tools. Among those names, Roger Kibbe's appeared. Surveillance efforts intensified, though carefully. Monitoring someone without alerting them requires coordination and patience. Detectives documented movements, travel patterns, and business activities. They compared these observations against timelines of known incidents. The alignment was troubling, yet law enforcement understood that circumstantial alignment would not suffice in court. That a breakthrough would require something tangible, something that could definitively connect a suspect to the crimes. Until then, they operated in a state of strategic vigilance. Meanwhile, families of victims continued seeking answers. Community gatherings and vigils reinforced the emotional weight of the investigation. Media coverage amplified stories of loss, humanizing individuals who might otherwise be reduced to statistics. The nickname I-5 Strangler became a shorthand for collective grief and unanswered questions. In Sacramento's neighborhoods, life went on. Children attended school. Businesses opened each morning. Traffic flowed steadily along Interstate 5. The ordinariness of daily routine stood in stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Roger Kibbe remained, outwardly, a man of routine. But routine, as investigators increasingly believed, can conceal repetition of another kind. The community sensed danger without knowing its source. Detectives sensed a suspect without yet possessing definitive proof. And Interstate 5 continued stretching north and south, a silent witness to events that were edging closer to exposure. As media attention slowly intensified, the atmosphere across Northern California shifted from quiet concern to guarded vigilance. The nickname I-5 Strangler was no longer confined to internal briefings or scattered articles. It had entered public vocabulary. Though authorities remained cautious in their statements, enough similarities between cases had surfaced to confirm what many feared. The disappearances were not random, yet fear did not manifest as chaos. It appeared instead as behavioral change. Hitchhiking, once viewed by some as a practical means of travel, declined noticeably. Families urged loved ones to avoid roadside travel after dark. Women commuting between cities shared safety plans with friends. Rest stops along Interstate 5, especially at night, felt different. Travelers moved with more awareness, scanning surroundings before entering vehicles or engaging in conversation. Law enforcement agencies increased cooperation in unprecedented ways. Departments that once operated largely within their own jurisdictions began sharing case files more openly. Meetings between counties became more frequent. The highway itself was treated as a unified investigative landscape rather than a series of isolated territories. This shift in collaboration marked a critical evolution in the case. Within investigative teams, the narrowing focus on individuals connected to upholstery work intensified. Fiber evidence had grown too consistent to ignore. Analysts believed that certain materials recovered in multiple cases were not common household fabrics. Their composition suggested commercial-grade upholstery textiles, the kind handled regularly by professionals in the trade. Roger Kibbe's business, located in Sacramento, naturally placed him within this professional category. Surveillance expanded carefully. Detectives observed his routines, documenting travel times and destinations. They reviewed business records where possible. They examined whether his schedule could plausibly align with the known timelines of disappearances. In several instances, there were troubling overlaps, periods where his whereabouts could not be fully accounted for. Still, caution remained paramount. Organized offenders often react unpredictably if they sense investigation. Any overt confrontation without sufficient evidence could compromise the entire case. Community tension grew as rumors circulated. Some speculated that the offender must be a drifter. Others believed he was likely a truck driver operating anonymously across state lines. The idea that the suspect might be a stable businessman embedded within Sacramento society seemed almost inconceivable to many. This disbelief highlights a recurring theme in serial cases. Danger is often imagined as external rather than internal. The archetype of a predator frequently conjures images of isolation and obvious deviance. But in reality, many organized offenders cultivate appearances of reliability and routine precisely to avoid scrutiny. Psychological profiling at this stage emphasized control, planning, and compartmentalization. The offender appeared capable of maintaining normal social interactions while concealing methodical criminal behavior. Such duality requires emotional detachment and calculated discipline, traits that, when hidden beneath everyday structure, are difficult to detect. Meanwhile, Interstate 5 continued its relentless rhythm. Truckers drove overnight routes. Families relocated between cities. Business owners traveled for meetings. Among the thousands of vehicles moving north and south, one driver blended in seamlessly. A man whose profession provided a legitimate explanation for travel and whose demeanor rarely drew attention. Inside law enforcement offices, anticipation grew that the case was approaching a turning point. Advances in forensic comparison methods increased confidence that fiber evidence could be tied more definitively to a source. Detectives understood that if they could connect specialized materials from crime scenes directly to a suspect's business inventory, the case would shift from circumstantial suspicion to prosecutable evidence. Such breakthroughs do not happen overnight. They are the result of incremental persistence. Families of victims remained central to the emotional weight of the investigation. Public gatherings reinforced the human dimension of the case, reminding communities that behind every headline was a person with relationships, aspirations, and unfinished stories. This collective awareness strengthened the resolve of investigators to move carefully but decisively. By the late 1980s, the quiet businessman in Sacramento was no longer just a name on a list. He was becoming the focal point of a tightening investigation. Surveillance logs grew thicker. Evidence comparisons advanced. Detectives prepared for the possibility that years of shadowed suspicion were about to converge into confrontation. The community sensed that answers were near, though few knew how close law enforcement believed they were. Interstate 5 remained illuminated by passing headlights each night, its long stretches indifferent to the tension unfolding along its edges. But the illusion of invisibility that had shielded the offender for years was beginning to erode. Control, once his greatest asset, was about to be tested. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Control. Long before a suspect is formally charged, long before a courtroom hears testimony, an investigation often turns inward toward a quieter discipline, the study of behavior. By the time law enforcement attention increasingly centered on Roger Kibbe, the question was no longer only who had committed the crimes along Interstate 5, but why they had unfolded in such a controlled and methodical pattern. The word that surfaced repeatedly in internal discussions was control. Control over environment, control over timing, control over victims, control over risk. Organized offenders differ sharply from impulsive perpetrators. Where impulsivity leaves chaos and unpredictable evidence, organization leaves patterns. In the I-5 corridor cases, repetition suggested deliberation. The spacing between incidents implied restraint. The locations pointed toward calculated selection rather than random opportunity. This behavioral consistency became a psychological map. Experts consulted during serial investigations often examine an offender's ability to compartmentalize. Compartmentalization allows an individual to separate public identity from private behavior with remarkable rigidity. To neighbors, colleagues, and even family members, the person appears routine-driven, structured, sometimes even disciplined to an extreme. Beneath that structure, however, exists a hidden architecture, one that supports actions entirely at odds with outward presentation. Roger Kibbe's life in Sacramento fit this outward framework. He maintained his upholstery business with precision. Those who interacted with him described someone methodical, at times strict, someone who valued order. Tools were kept neatly. Materials were organized. Measurements were exact. Upholstery is not a casual craft. It requires patience and attention to fine detail. Fabric must align properly. Seams must hold under tension. Errors are visible and must be corrected. Psychologists reviewing such occupational details do not suggest that profession determines behavior. Instead, they examine how a profession might reinforce pre-existing traits. If an individual already values control and precision, a trade demanding those qualities can strengthen them further. Routine becomes habitual, structure becomes comfort, and comfort can create concealment. The pattern along Interstate 5 suggested someone who preferred predictability within unpredictability. The highway provided movement and anonymity, but the offender appeared to operate within familiar geographic zones. He did not scatter randomly across the state. He remained within a corridor he understood well. Familiarity reduces risk. It allows calculation. Control also manifests in victim selection. Investigators believe the offender approached individuals in transitional circumstances, moments when they were traveling, waiting, or navigating instability. Transitional spaces create vulnerability. The offender's ability to initiate contact without immediate alarm implied a demeanor that did not outwardly signal danger. This duality, calm presentation paired with concealed intent, is psychologically significant. Organized offenders often rely on composure. Anxiety or visible agitation would undermine their ability to approach strangers convincingly. Instead, they cultivate neutrality, perhaps even helpfulness. A simple offer of a ride, a casual conversation, The initial interaction becomes a performance. Performance requires rehearsal. The spacing between incidents in the I-5 cases reinforced this interpretation. There were pauses, intervals where no known offenses occurred. Such gaps suggested the offender did not act purely on uncontrollable impulse. He waited. He resumed normal routines. He blended back into daily life. This restraint indicates internal regulation rather than explosive compulsion. From an investigative standpoint, this made the suspect more dangerous, but also more predictable. Predictable not in schedule, but in psychology. Someone who values control often repeats methods. Repetition builds confidence. Confidence builds habit. And habit eventually produces traceable consistency. Fiber evidence in this case hinted at such repetition. The recurrence of specialized materials suggested the offender relied on tools or supplies readily available to him, items embedded within his professional environment. The psychological intersection between profession and crime became impossible to ignore. Still, investigators approached the matter cautiously. Psychological profiling guides inquiry. It does not replace evidence. The danger of confirmation bias, seeing patterns only because one expects them, is ever present in complex cases. Detectives therefore grounded their analysis in tangible findings while using behavioral assessment as supplementary guidance. AS scrutiny increasingly focused on Roger Kibbe. Questions emerged about his private demeanor. Was he rigid beyond professional necessity? Did he display a need for dominance in personal relationships? Were there signs of emotional detachment? Publicly available impressions described him as strict, sometimes controlling, but not outwardly volatile. Yet volatility is not always visible. Some individuals internalize tension rather than express it openly. The absence of explosive behavior does not equate to emotional balance. In fact, extreme outward calm can coexist with deeply compartmentalized internal impulses. The community remained largely unaware of the psychological lens narrowing around a Sacramento businessman. To most residents, the case remained a haunting but abstract thread along Interstate 5. Few connected the disciplined upholsterer in their city to the behavioral profile emerging within law enforcement briefings. But investigators were no longer looking solely at geography. They were studying mindset, and the concept of control was guiding them steadily toward confrontation. As investigators deepened their psychological assessment, the focus shifted from broad behavioral theory to personal alignment. It was no longer enough to say the offender was organized, mobile, and controlled. Detectives now asked a more pointed question. Did Roger Kibbe's personal history and lifestyle meaningfully reflect the same structure implied by the crimes? The answer was unsettlingly consistent. Kibbe had spent decades building a life defined by routine. He married, raised children, and maintained steady employment. His upholstery business required precision, not only in stitching and measuring, but in time management. Orders had deadlines. Clients expected reliability. Mistakes cost money. Discipline was embedded into his professional identity. But structure in public life does not automatically translate to internal stability. Psychological profiling often examines whether an individual demonstrates a pronounced need for dominance or control in interpersonal settings. Subtle accounts from those who knew Kibbe described him as rigid, occasionally domineering in demeanor. He valued obedience, order, and predictability. These traits, while not criminal in themselves, resonated with the investigative theory that the offender sought environments where he dictated terms completely. Interstate 5 offered such environments that a vehicle is an enclosed space. Once doors are shut and the road stretches ahead, control shifts decisively to the driver. The psychological symbolism of this dynamic was not lost on investigators. The highway was open and public, Yet the interior of a moving vehicle became private and contained. For someone driven by a need to dominate scenarios, this setting provided both opportunity and isolation. The spacing between incidents also took on new psychological significance. Organized offenders who act intermittently often do so because they can regulate their impulses. They may compartmentalize behavior, returning to ordinary routines between events. This rhythm creates an illusion of normalcy. It allows the individual to reassure themselves that they remain in control, not only of others, but of their own actions. Control over impulse reinforces self-perception that in reviewing timelines. Investigators noted that the intervals between confirmed cases were neither random nor chaotic. There were measurable pauses. Such pauses suggested the offender was not acting out of spontaneous rage. Instead, the crimes appeared integrated into a controlled pattern, something that fit around an existing lifestyle rather than disrupted it. For Roger Kibbe, that lifestyle revolved around his upholstery shop and family life in Sacramento. The irony of his profession continued to deepen. Upholstery materials are durable, textured, and often distinctive. They leave fibers. They require specialized tools. The investigative team increasingly believed that the offender had drawn directly from his workspace, not necessarily out of carelessness, but out of familiarity. When someone repeatedly uses materials within their immediate environment, they may underestimate their traceability. Confidence breeds oversight. Investigators also explored the concept of ritual within the pattern. Ritual differs from method. Method is what an offender must do to accomplish an act. Ritual is what they choose to repeat because it reinforces psychological gratification. The recurrence of similar environments and materials suggested ritualistic consistency. Repetition can create a sense of mastery, a belief that one's system is flawless. That belief can be dangerous because the longer a ritual persists, the more evidence it accumulates. While the public remained largely unaware of these psychological developments, law enforcement agencies were steadily narrowing their attention. Surveillance logs and forensic comparisons were converging with behavioral theory. The alignment was no longer abstract. It was increasingly personal. Still, caution defined every step. Psychological profiling cannot substitute for proof. Detectives required direct physical evidence tying Kibbe to specific cases. They also recognized that confronting a suspect prematurely could jeopardize years of investigation. The community's unease continued simmering in the background. The I-5 Strangler remained an ominous presence in headlines, but the identity behind the nickname had not yet been revealed. Sacramento residents carried on with daily routines, unaware that investigators believed the source of the corridor's fear might be living quietly among them. Within the investigative team, however, the psychology of control had shifted from theory to confirmation bias risk. They were acutely aware of the danger of seeing what they expected to see. To counter this, they double-checked every assumption against hard data. Fiber analysis results were re-examined. Travel timelines were scrutinized. Background checks expanded. Each step reinforced the same unsettling possibility. The man who measured fabric with meticulous care, the businessman who drove regularly along Interstate 5, the disciplined, structured resident of Sacramento that he matched the psychological framework too precisely to ignore. And yet, until evidence crossed the threshold into undeniable linkage, he remained legally just another citizen. The study of control had illuminated motive and mindset. The next phase would require something far more tangible, a breakthrough that transformed suspicion into arrest. The pattern had been mapped. The psychology had been outlined. Now investigators needed proof. Chapter 6. A break in the case. For years, The investigation into the I-5 corridor disappearances had advanced in increments rather than leaps. Patterns had been identified. Psychological profiles had been refined. Surveillance had quietly narrowed. But in long-running cases involving organized offenders, there comes a moment when accumulation reaches critical mass. When the weight of evidence begins to press decisively in one direction, that be why the late 1980s, that moment was approaching. Fiber analysis, once considered supplemental, had become central. Advances in forensic comparison allowed investigators to evaluate textile characteristics with greater specificity. The fibers recovered in multiple cases were not generic household threads. They bore traits consistent with commercial upholstery materials, distinct in composition and weave. This detail redirected the investigation from abstract profiling to targeted inquiry. Detectives revisited lists of local upholstery businesses within Sacramento and surrounding areas. Several names surfaced, but one aligned repeatedly with geographic and temporal patterns: Roger Kibbe. His shop provided legitimate access to the type of materials under forensic scrutiny. More importantly, his documented travel along Interstate 5 corresponded with windows of opportunity in several cases. Still, circumstantial alignment required confirmation. Surveillance intensified discreetly. Investigators tracked movements, noting when Kibbe left Sacramento, how long he remained away, and which stretches of highway he used. They documented license plate sightings and travel frequencies. The pattern was troublingly consistent with earlier case timelines, but detectives needed more than consistency. They needed a moment, an event that bridged suspicion and certainty. That moment arrived unexpectedly in 1987. A young woman survived an encounter that would later prove pivotal. Unlike previous cases that ended in disappearance, this incident resulted in a report detailed enough to provide investigators with actionable information. The survivor described her attacker, the vehicle involved, and aspects of the encounter that resonated with the established pattern along Interstate 5. The description of the vehicle became critical. When investigators cross-referenced the reported details with vehicle registrations in the Sacramento area, Roger Kibbe's name surfaced once again. He owned a vehicle matching the general description provided. While vehicle similarities alone were insufficient for arrest, the alignment with existing suspicions intensified scrutiny. Law enforcement moved cautiously but decisively. The survivor's testimony provided probable cause to initiate more direct investigative measures. Detectives prepared for the possibility of obtaining search warrants, a significant escalation after years of quiet surveillance. Any search would need to be meticulous. If Kibbe was indeed the offender, evidence might be subtle and deliberately concealed. When authorities finally executed a search of his residence and business premises, they approached with methodical precision. Upholstery materials were cataloged. Tools were examined. Fibers were collected for laboratory comparison. Vehicles were inspected for trace evidence. Forensic teams understood the stakes. This was no longer theoretical profiling. This was an opportunity to connect tangible items in a suspect's possession to physical traces preserved in unsolved cases. The comparison process required patience. Fibers retrieved from Kibbe's shop and vehicle were analyzed under microscopes and matched against samples from multiple crime scenes. Weave patterns, dye compositions, and microscopic characteristics were scrutinized. The results were increasingly persuasive. Investigators discovered fibers in Kibbe's possession that were consistent with those recovered in prior cases. While fiber evidence is rarely definitive in isolation, the cumulative weight across multiple incidents strengthened the case dramatically. The break in the case was not a single dramatic confession or televised confrontation. It was quieter, forensic, methodical, grounded in science rather than spectacle. Years of incremental work had converged into something actionable. Kibbe was arrested in 1987 that the news marked a turning point for Sacramento and communities along Interstate 5. The elusive I-5 Strangler now had a name and a face. A local businessman, long embedded in the community, stood accused of a pattern of crimes stretching back nearly a decade. For investigators, the arrest was both relief and responsibility. Relief that the pattern might finally be halted. Responsibility to ensure that the evidence assembled would withstand courtroom scrutiny. But the case was far from over. Arrest initiates a new phase: interrogation, charging decisions, and the painstaking process of linking individual counts to prosecutable evidence. Organized offenders do not always cooperate. Some deny, some deflect, some remain silent. Roger Kibbe's response would become the next critical chapter. For now, the break in the case had shifted the investigation from shadowed suspicion to public accountability. The highway still stretched north and south, but the illusion of invisibility had ended. The arrest of Roger Kibbe in 1987 marked the first visible fracture in a mystery that had stretched nearly a decade. For years, the I-5 corridor had been defined by absence: missing persons, unanswered questions, quiet suspicion. Now, for the first time, law enforcement stood before cameras with a named suspect in custody. But an arrest is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of proof. Following his detention, investigators faced a crucial task: transforming a network of forensic consistency and behavioral alignment into a prosecutable case that could withstand rigorous courtroom examination. The fiber evidence, while compelling, required careful presentation. Jurors would need to understand not just that fibers were similar, but why that similarity mattered within the broader investigative framework. Meanwhile, interrogation strategies were carefully considered. Organized offenders, particularly those who have operated undetected for years, often exhibit calculated composure during questioning. They may deny involvement categorically. They may offer partial truths. They may attempt to control the narrative just as they controlled their routines. Investigators approaching Kibbe understood that patience would be essential. Early questioning did not yield sweeping admissions. Instead, it required incremental confrontation with evidence. When presented with forensic findings, fibers consistent with those from unsolved cases, the conversations became more focused. Detectives did not rely on psychological pressure alone. They relied on tangible facts. The survivor's testimony from 1987 remained pivotal. Her ability to describe the vehicle and encounter provided prosecutors with a living witness, a voice capable of recounting events directly rather than relying solely on forensic reconstruction. This distinction strengthened the case considerably. Search results from Kibbe's residence and upholstery shop continued to be analyzed. Tools were compared to marks associated with evidence in several cases. Textile samples were cataloged against recovered fibers. Each comparison reinforced the narrative investigators had spent years building. Public reaction in Sacramento was mixed, shock intertwined with disbelief. The idea that a local businessman, someone integrated into the rhythms of community life, could be connected to the I-5 Strangler identity unsettled residents deeply. Serial cases often disrupt assumptions about what danger looks like. In this instance, danger had worn the mask of normalcy. Media coverage intensified, though authorities remained cautious about releasing sensitive details that could compromise the integrity of prosecution. The term I-5 Strangler became firmly attached to Roger Kibbe's name. What had once been an anonymous label now carried personal identification. As prosecutors prepared charges, they faced the complexity inherent in long-running serial investigations. Not every suspected case could immediately be brought to trial. Evidence varies in strength. Some cases are supported primarily by circumstantial alignment, while others are reinforced by forensic consistency. Prosecutorial strategy required selecting counts that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The legal process moved deliberately to in 1991. Roger Kibbe was convicted of multiple counts related to the series of crimes along Interstate 5. The convictions were grounded heavily in fiber evidence, survivor testimony, and the cumulative investigative work spanning years. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, effectively ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. For families of victims, the verdict provided a measure of closure, though closure in such cases is never complete. The years of uncertainty could not be undone. The lives interrupted could not be restored. But accountability had been established. Within law enforcement circles, the case was studied as an example of persistence. It demonstrated the importance of inter-county collaboration, the growing power of forensic fiber analysis, and the role of psychological profiling in guiding but not replacing evidence. The arrest had not come from dramatic confrontation. It had come from patient accumulation. Interstate 5, once associated with a shadowed predator, gradually returned to its primary identity as a corridor of commerce and travel. Yet the memory of the I-5 Strangler lingered, a reminder that even the most ordinary routes can conceal extraordinary danger. Roger Kibbe's life shifted from private compartmentalization to public accountability. The control that had defined his alleged pattern dissolved within the structure of incarceration. Prison life offers little autonomy, little privacy, little ability to dictate one's environment. The irony was unmistakable that a man who had allegedly orchestrated years of controlled encounters along a vast highway now faced the rigid confines of a cell. But even with conviction secured, the story was not entirely finished. Legal appeals would follow. Questions about additional cases persisted. And decades later, an unexpected chapter would close his life in a manner few could have predicted. For now, however, the break in the case had accomplished what years of uncertainty had delayed. It had placed a name, a face, and a sentence upon the identity of the I-5 Strangler. The highway continued forward, and so did the consequences. Long before DNA analysis became the dominant force in criminal investigations, there was another discipline that quietly transformed complex cases: fiber forensics. In the investigation that ultimately led to Roger Kibbe's conviction, fibers were not merely supplementary details. They became central threads in a web of accountability. To understand the significance of fiber evidence in this case, it is important to appreciate how microscopic materials function in forensic science. Every fabric has characteristics: composition, dye structure, weave pattern, manufacturing process. Under magnification, these traits can distinguish commercial upholstery textiles from everyday clothing fibers. The differences are subtle, but measurable. In the late 1970s and 1980s, forensic laboratories were refining their ability to analyze such materials. While not as individually unique as DNA, fibers can strongly suggest common origin when multiple characteristics align. The key lies in accumulation. One fiber might be coincidence. A repeated pattern of fibers across multiple cases becomes something far more compelling. In the I-5 corridor investigation, analysts noticed recurring textile elements. These were not random cotton strands typical of everyday garments. Some bore features consistent with upholstery-grade material, heavier, more durable, distinct in construction. Such fibers are commonly found in furniture manufacturing and repair environments, not widely distributed in public spaces. This observation shifted investigative strategy dramatically. When Roger Kibby's upholstery business came under scrutiny, forensic teams understood that comparison would be critical. Samples collected from his shop, fabric rolls, scraps, finished materials, were cataloged meticulously. Microscopic slides were prepared. Dye composition was evaluated. Weave patterns were measured and documented. The process required extraordinary patience. Forensic fiber comparison is rarely cinematic. It involves hours under magnification, comparing cross-sections of threads, examining refractive properties under different lighting, and analyzing dye absorption at a molecular level. Analysts search for consistency across multiple variables, not just color, but structure and chemical composition. In several instances, fibers recovered from victims and associated evidence displayed consistent characteristics with materials found in Kibby's professional inventory. While a single characteristic might not be definitive, the alignment across multiple properties strengthened the inference of common source. Importantly, forensic experts do not claim absolute uniqueness in fiber evidence. Instead, they assess probability. The question becomes, how likely is it that these fibers originated from an unrelated source? In Kibby's case, the convergence of upholstery-grade materials, geographic alignment, and behavioral pattern made alternative explanations increasingly improbable. The courtroom presentation of fiber evidence required careful explanation. Jurors needed to understand that fiber analysis is cumulative. Prosecutors illustrated how repeated discovery of similar materials across separate cases reduced the likelihood of coincidence. Expert witnesses described laboratory methods, emphasizing objectivity and scientific rigor. Defense teams often challenge fiber evidence by suggesting contamination or widespread availability. In this case, however, the specificity of upholstery materials and the consistency across incidents posed significant hurdles for such arguments. Beyond the technical aspects, fiber evidence carried symbolic weight. Threads are small, often invisible to the naked eye, yet they endure. They transfer easily from one surface to another. They cling to fabric, upholstery, and vehicle interiors. In many investigations, fibers become silent witnesses, microscopic storytellers that persist long after human memory fades. For investigators who had worked the I-5 cases for years, the laboratory confirmations felt like validation. The theory of an organized offender connected to upholstery materials was no longer speculative. It was grounded in measurable science. The discipline of fiber forensics also underscored a broader investigative lesson. Small details matter. In the absence of direct eyewitness accounts in many cases, physical trace evidence becomes paramount. The offender's perceived control, his careful planning, his geographic familiarity, had not prevented microscopic transfer. Control does not eliminate evidence. It merely attempts to manage it. And in this case, the smallest fragments prove powerful. Roger Kibby's conviction relied heavily on this scientific foundation. Without fiber evidence, the prosecution might have struggled to bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. With it, they constructed a narrative rooted not in speculation, but in tangible connection. The study of forensic threads revealed something profound. Even the most organized patterns leave traces behind. Even the most methodical routines cannot erase microscopic transfer. Every environment we enter, every surface we contact, becomes part of an invisible exchange in the I-5 investigation. Those exchanges accumulated quietly over years, and eventually, they spoke. As the prosecution prepared its case against Roger Kibbe, fiber evidence evolved from a technical detail into the backbone of the narrative. In court, it was not presented as dramatic revelation, but as disciplined science. Incremental, repeatable, and grounded in laboratory methodology, TO jurors unfamiliar with forensic textiles, experts began by explaining transfer theory. Fibers move easily. When two surfaces come into contact, microscopic strands can pass between them. Upholstery materials, due to their density and durability, are particularly prone to shedding fibers that adhere to clothing or other fabrics. Once transferred, those fibers may persist long after the initial contact. In the I-5 cases, analysts testified that fibers recovered from victims shared multiple consistent characteristics with upholstery materials traced back to Kibby's business. This was not limited to color similarity. Experts described alignment in weave structure, polymer composition, and dye properties. The convergence of these characteristics reduced the statistical likelihood of random match. The prosecution emphasized accumulation. Point 1 fiber might be coincidence. Point 2 might still allow doubt. But repeated recovery of consistent upholstery-grade fibers across multiple cases and consistent alignment with a single professional source narrowed reasonable alternatives. Defense attorneys challenged the reliability of fiber comparison, as is common in such cases. They questioned whether similar materials might exist in other upholstery shops. They raised the possibility of environmental contamination. They probed the chain of custody for each sample. Forensic witnesses responded by outlining the safeguards in evidence collection and laboratory handling. Samples had been preserved under controlled conditions. Comparisons were conducted using standardized microscopic techniques. Analysts described peer review processes and documentation procedures. The courtroom became, in many ways, a classroom in forensic science. Beyond fibers, investigators also examined tools and binding materials associated with Kibby's profession. While not every item could be definitively linked to specific cases, the presence of specialized equipment reinforced the contextual alignment between occupation and offense pattern. The narrative presented to the jury was cumulative. Geography, behavior, materials, and survivor testimony converging into a cohesive picture. The 1987 survivor played a critical role in strengthening this foundation. Her account provided a living voice that corroborated elements of the forensic story. Vehicle description, encounter dynamics, and timeline consistency offered jurors something tangible to anchor the scientific evidence. The conviction that followed in 1991 rested heavily on this combination. Roger Kibbe was found guilty of multiple counts and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For law enforcement agencies that had collaborated across jurisdictions, the verdict represented validation of years of persistence. For families, it marked a measure of accountability. The fiber evidence in the Kibbe case became a study in how trace materials can carry extraordinary weight. It also reflected a transitional era in forensic science, a time before widespread DNA databases, when investigators relied heavily on microscopic comparison disciplines. Importantly, the case demonstrated both the strength and limitations of fiber analysis. While persuasive, such evidence requires careful contextual framing. It cannot stand entirely alone. It gains power through repetition, corroboration, and alignment with other investigative findings. Years later, forensic standards across the United States would evolve further, incorporating DNA technology as the dominant evidentiary tool. Yet the Kibbe prosecution remained an example of how disciplined laboratory work, combined with inter-county cooperation, can resolve long-running serial cases in a broader sense. The forensic threads in this investigation symbolized something larger. They represented the idea that even the most controlled systems unravel under scrutiny. The offender's belief in his ability to operate undetected along Interstate 5 had been undermined not by dramatic confrontation, but by microscopic transfer, fragments invisible to the naked eye yet undeniable under magnification. The discipline that defined his professional life had inadvertently created the evidence that led to his conviction. At AS, he began serving his sentence. Interstate 5 gradually shed its association with an active predator. The corridor returned to its routine function as a conduit of travel and commerce. Yet within forensic circles, the case endured as a reminder. Patience, collaboration, and attention to detail can bridge years of uncertainty. Roger Kibbe's story, however, did not end with conviction. Decades later, within the confines of prison, a setting defined by rigid control structures of its own, an unexpected final chapter would unfold. But the forensic threads that secured accountability would remain central to understanding how the I-5 Strangler was ultimately unmasked. Science had spoken quietly, and it had been enough. Chapter 8: Arrest and Interrogation. The arrest of Roger Kibbe in 1987 marked a visible turning point in a case that had lingered in shadow for nearly a decade. For investigators, it was not a moment of celebration, but one of concentration. Years of quiet surveillance, forensic comparison, and inter-county coordination had led to this point. Now the responsibility shifted toward confirmation. Arrest is a procedural act. Interrogation is psychological. When Kibbe was taken into custody, law enforcement approached the next phase with measured strategy. Organized offenders, particularly those who have operated undetected for years, often display composure during questioning. They are accustomed to control of their routines, their environments, and their narratives. Removing that control abruptly can produce varying reactions: denial, calculated silence, or selective disclosure. Detectives prepared carefully. Interrogation rooms are intentionally neutral. Sparse, controlled. The environment shifts authority from suspect to investigator. For someone whose behavioral profile emphasized structure and dominance, this shift in power dynamic carried psychological weight. The routine that had defined his life, business operations, personal schedules, independent travel, was suddenly replaced by confinement and direct questioning. Initial interviews focused on background and routine. Where did he travel? Why? How often? These questions were not accusatory. They were foundational. Establishing baseline responses allows investigators to identify deviations later. Kibbe, by most accounts, remained measured in demeanor. He denied involvement in violent crimes and offered explanations for his travel consistent with his upholstery business. But investigators did not rely solely on verbal exchange. They presented evidence incrementally. The 1987 survivor's testimony provided a powerful starting point. Her description of the vehicle and encounter aligned closely with Kibbe's known circumstances. When confronted with these parallels, the interrogation shifted from general inquiry to pointed questioning. Detectives assessed not only his answers, but his reactions, pauses, deflections, tone shifts. Organized offenders often attempt to maintain narrative control by minimizing or reframing events. Investigators counter this by anchoring conversation in verifiable facts. Fiber evidence, for example, was not presented as speculation. It was described as laboratory-confirmed consistency between materials found in his possession and those recovered from multiple cases. The accumulation of such evidence narrows conversational space. Over time, interrogation can become less about extracting dramatic confession and more about confirming details that only the offender would know. In some serial investigations, suspects eventually provide partial admissions, not necessarily out of remorse, but as a calculated attempt to influence narrative framing. Public records indicate that Kibbe ultimately admitted involvement in multiple crimes after conviction, though these admissions came within the broader legal process rather than a single explosive interrogation session. His statements aligned with elements investigators had long suspected: reinforcing the validity of the forensic framework already in place. Interrogation strategy in cases like this is rarely cinematic. It unfolds in sessions, patient, deliberate, guided by documentation rather than emotion. Detectives rely on preparation more than improvisation. Each question is grounded in evidence. Each response is evaluated against established facts. For Sacramento residents following the case through media updates, the arrest felt like sudden revelation. For investigators, it felt like transition. The goal was no longer identifying a suspect. It was securing conviction. As Kibbe awaited trial, pre-trial hearings examined the admissibility of evidence. Defense attorneys scrutinized search procedures, fiber comparison methodology, and survivor testimony. Prosecutors prepared expert witnesses to articulate scientific findings clearly and convincingly. Meanwhile, the broader psychological narrative remained relevant. A man whose life had revolved around structure now faced institutional confinement. Jail imposed a rigid schedule, meals at designated times, limited movement, monitored communication. For someone accustomed to autonomy and routine control, this represented profound disruption. The interrogation phase did not produce theatrical confession. Instead, it produced corroboration, alignment between suspect statements and existing evidence. In complex serial cases, that alignment can be as powerful as admission. The control dynamic had shifted, and the investigation was entering its most public stage. As pretrial proceedings advanced, the interrogation phase gradually blended into the broader legal strategy. What investigators had extracted in interview rooms now had to withstand scrutiny under oath. Every statement, every documented response, every forensic comparison would be examined in open court. Roger Kibbe's demeanor during this period remained outwardly controlled. Courtroom observers later described him as reserved, composed, rarely displaying overt emotion. This composure aligned with the psychological profile investigators had constructed years earlier, a man accustomed to compartmentalization, capable of maintaining external calm even under escalating pressure. But composure does not negate consequence. Prosecutors focused on building a case that relied less on confession and more on corroboration. They understood that admissions, particularly those made after arrest, can be challenged on procedural grounds. Instead, they presented a layered argument: survivor testimony establishing direct encounter, fiber evidence linking materials to multiple cases, travel patterns consistent with offense timelines, and the cumulative investigative work spanning nearly a decade in preparing for trial. Forensic experts refined their explanations to ensure clarity. Jurors unfamiliar with textile science needed to understand why upholstery fibers were significant. Demonstrations illustrated how microscopic strands transfer between surfaces. Charts showed how multiple fiber characteristics, color, weave, polymer structure, aligned consistently across recovered samples and materials from Kibbe's shop. Defense attorneys countered by questioning the certainty of fiber analysis. They suggested alternative sources, potential contamination, or coincidental similarity. Such challenges are common in cases built heavily on trace evidence. The prosecution responded by emphasizing repetition and specificity. The argument was not that a single fiber proved guilt, but that a pattern of consistent fibers across separate incidents, combined with geographic and behavioral alignment, reduced reasonable doubt. Throughout proceedings, the 1987 survivor remained central. Her testimony humanized the forensic framework. She described her encounter in clear, measured detail, identifying aspects of the vehicle and interaction that corresponded with investigators' findings. In a courtroom environment, A living witness often anchors abstract scientific explanation to lived experience. For families of victims, the trial reopened wounds long carried quietly. Years of uncertainty had preceded this moment. While conviction could not restore what had been lost, it offered recognition. A formal acknowledgement that the pattern along Interstate 5 had been real and that accountability had been assigned. In 1991, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Roger Kibbe was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, effectively ensuring he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the sustained investigative effort required to bring the case to resolution. The interrogation phase, though less dramatic than popular portrayals of criminal cases, had fulfilled its purpose. It had clarified inconsistencies, reinforced forensic alignment, and prepared the foundation for trial. The absence of theatrical confession did not weaken the case. Instead, the weight of evidence spoke steadily and convincingly. In the aftermath of conviction, Sacramento began a gradual psychological recalibration. The identity of the I-5 Strangler was no longer abstract. The threat had been contained within prison walls. Interstate 5, though forever marked by memory, resumed its primary role as corridor rather than crime scene. For law enforcement, the case became instructional. It demonstrated the value of interagency collaboration long before digital databases made such coordination routine. It highlighted the importance of trace evidence and patience. It underscored the need to balance psychological profiling with tangible proof. For Roger Kibbe, control had shifted permanently. The autonomy of his upholstery shop and highway travel gave way to institutional routine. Prison life operates on strict schedules dictated by authority, meals, counts, limited recreation. The environment allows little personal governance. The man once suspected of orchestrating encounters along open highways now lived within concrete boundaries. Yet the story was not entirely complete. Decades later, an unexpected event within prison would draw his name back into headlines. The arc of the I-5 Strangler would extend beyond courtroom conviction into a final, unforeseen chapter. For now, however, the arrest and interrogation phase had accomplished its purpose. The shadow that once stretched along Interstate 5 had been named, confronted, and sentenced. Chapter 9. Inside the trial. When a long-running investigation finally reaches the courtroom, years of quiet work become public record. Files once confined to evidence rooms are unfolded before jurors. Laboratory notes are translated into plain language. Timelines that once lived on office walls are reconstructed on presentation boards. In the case of Roger Kibbe, the man known publicly as the I-5 Strangler, the trial was not only about individual counts. It was about proving that a pattern had existed and that it pointed to one organized source. Courtrooms are structured environments. Every statement must follow procedure. Every objection must be addressed through established rules. For someone who had allegedly operated through controlled repetition for years, this new setting imposed a different kind of control, one dictated by law. Prosecutors opened by outlining the pattern along Interstate 5. They did not begin with emotion. They began with geography. Maps were displayed showing the corridor running north and south through California. Locations tied to the cases were marked carefully. The visual effect was striking, a vertical alignment tracing the highway's path. From geography, they moved to repetition. The jury was guided through timelines, dates of disappearances, intervals between incidents, and the consistent presence of travel environments. The prosecution emphasized organization rather than chaos. The narrative suggested deliberation, patience, and calculated mobility. Then came the science. forensic experts took the stand to explain fiber analysis. Under oath, they described how samples were collected, preserved, and compared. Microscopic images were presented to demonstrate similarities in weave and dye composition. The explanation was technical but deliberate. Jurors were reminded that fiber evidence does not claim uniqueness like fingerprints or DNA. Instead, it establishes probability through consistent characteristics across multiple variables. Defense counsel challenged these assertions. They questioned whether similar upholstery fibers could exist elsewhere. They scrutinized laboratory methods and cross-examined analysts about margin of error. Such exchanges are routine in cases built on trace evidence. The prosecution responded by returning to accumulation, not one fiber, but repeated recovery across separate incidents, all aligning with materials traced back to Kibby's professional inventory. The courtroom dynamic was controlled but intense. The 1987 survivor's testimony brought immediacy to the proceedings. She described the encounter that had allowed investigators to identify the vehicle and suspect. Her voice, steady and detailed, connected the abstract forensic narrative to lived experience. For jurors, this testimony anchored scientific evidence in human reality. Throughout the trial, Roger Kibbe maintained a restrained demeanor. Observers noted that he rarely displayed visible emotion. This composure mirrored the psychological profile previously outlined by investigators: disciplined, compartmentalized, outwardly controlled. But within the courtroom, control belonged to the legal process. The prosecution also addressed the broader investigative effort. Detectives from multiple counties testified about collaboration along the Interstate 5 corridor. They described how information sharing evolved over time, transforming isolated cases into a unified theory. This interagency coordination strengthened credibility, demonstrating that conclusions were not reached hastily or by a single department. Defense attorneys sought to introduce doubt by highlighting the passage of time. Some incidents dated back nearly a decade. Memories fade. Evidence can degrade. They suggested that the prosecution's narrative relied heavily on retrospective interpretation, connecting dots that might appear aligned only in hindsight. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing preserved physical evidence. Fibers do not forget. Laboratory documentation, maintained carefully, provided continuity across years. The argument was not built solely on memory, but on material trace. Inside the courtroom, the I-5 corridor became more than a highway. It became a framework for accountability. Each marked location on the map represented not only geography, but story, a life intersecting with an organized pattern. Trials of this magnitude are rarely swift. Witnesses are called. Cross-examinations unfold. Legal arguments stretch across weeks. The process demands patience from jurors, families, and legal teams alike. For those who had followed the case from its early days of uncertainty, the public presentation of evidence felt like culmination. Yet verdicts are never guaranteed. The prosecution's burden was to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense's responsibility was to introduce alternative explanations. The jury's task was to weigh science, testimony, and credibility. As proceedings moved toward closing arguments, the courtroom carried a quiet gravity. Years of investigation, grief, and persistence had narrowed to this moment of collective judgment. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, both sides distilled weeks of testimony into final arguments designed to shape the jury's interpretation. In cases built on patterns rather than a single witnessed event, closing statements carry unusual weight. They must transform accumulation into clarity. The prosecution began by returning to the spine of the case, Interstate 5. They reminded jurors that the highway was not incidental background. It was the unifying corridor linking incidents across years. Maps were revisited. Timelines were reassembled. What had once seemed isolated was presented as structured repetition. They emphasized organization. The offender, they argued, did not act impulsively. He selected environments with minimal visibility. He operated within geographic zones he understood well. He demonstrated patience between incidents, suggesting calculated restraint. These elements, prosecutors maintained, pointed toward one individual capable of sustaining such a pattern without attracting immediate suspicion. Then came the science again, simplified but firm. Fiber evidence was reframed not as abstract microscopy, but as persistent trace. Upholstery-grade fibers recovered in multiple cases aligned with materials found in Roger Kibby's professional inventory. Jurors were reminded that while fibers may not carry the singular precision of DNA, the repetition across separate incidents reduced coincidence to improbability. The prosecution stressed cumulative probability, each aligned characteristic narrowing alternative explanations. The survivor's testimony was invoked as living confirmation. Her description of the encounter, vehicle, and circumstances had guided investigators toward Kibbe years earlier. Her presence in court underscored that the case was not built solely on lab reports, but on lived experience. Defense counsel approached their closing with a different focus: doubt. They argued that fiber analysis, while informative, is not absolute. They questioned whether similar upholstery materials might be present in other workshops across California. They highlighted the time gap between incidents and trial, suggesting that retrospective pattern building can create illusions of certainty. They urged jurors to remember the standard, beyond reasonable doubt, that in cases involving serial patterns, this standard becomes particularly complex. Jurors must decide whether accumulation of circumstantial alignment, reinforced by forensic consistency in testimony, reaches the threshold of certainty required by law. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from argument to waiting. Families sat quietly. Attorneys reviewed notes. Reporters prepared for outcome statements. Roger Kibbe remained composed, his expression largely unreadable. Deliberations lasted days. Jurors revisited fiber charts. They examined maps again. They reviewed testimony transcripts. The task before them was not emotional closure, but legal determination. In 1991, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts. The courtroom reaction was restrained but palpable. For families, it marked recognition, acknowledgement that the pattern along Interstate 5 had been real and that responsibility had been assigned. For investigators, it validated years of collaboration and patience. Sentencing followed, imposing a lengthy prison term that effectively guaranteed Kibbe would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The judge's remarks emphasized the gravity of the crimes and the sustained impact on communities along the highway corridor. Public reaction in Sacramento reflected a mixture of relief and disbelief. The I-5 Strangler, once an anonymous presence haunting news reports, was now definitively identified and confined. The highway, though forever marked by memory, no longer carried the uncertainty of an active predator. Inside legal circles, the trial became a case study in cumulative evidence. It illustrated how interagency cooperation, forensic trace analysis, and survivor testimony can converge to resolve complex serial investigations even in the absence of DNA. For Roger Kibbe, the transition from defendant to inmate marked a profound shift in environment. The autonomy that had characterized his earlier life dissolved into institutional routine. Prison schedules are rigid. Movement is restricted. Privacy is limited. For someone whose alleged pattern revolved around control, Incarceration represented irreversible loss of authority, yet history rarely ends neatly at sentencing. Decades would pass with Kibbe behind bars. Appeals would be filed and denied. The case would gradually fade from headlines, though not from memory. And then, unexpectedly, his name would reemerge in connection with a final event that closed the arc of his life in a manner no one had anticipated for now. However, the trial had achieved its primary purpose. The pattern had been examined publicly, the evidence had been weighed, and the verdict had been delivered. Chapter 10: Life Behind Bars. When the courtroom doors closed and sentencing concluded, Roger Kibbe's world narrowed from open highways to reinforced walls. The man once associated with movement along Interstate 5 now entered a system defined by immobility. Prison life is structured with precision: counts at designated hours, meals at fixed times, limited recreation, restricted communication. For someone whose psychological profile emphasized control, the shift was profound. Incarceration does not erase history, but it reframes it. Kibbe was committed to the California state prison system following his 1991 conviction. Within that system, identity is reduced to an inmate number, routine, and classification level. Autonomy diminishes. Schedules are imposed externally rather than chosen. Movement is monitored. Interactions are regulated. Observers of long-term incarceration often note that individuals who previously exercised control in criminal patterns must adapt to institutional hierarchy. Prison environments operate on explicit and implicit rules. Authority rests with correctional staff, and social dynamics among inmates create additional layers of structure. For Kibbe, the transition from small business owner to inmate required recalibration. The upholstery shop that once symbolized order and independence was replaced by a cell measured in feet rather than miles. The vast corridor of Interstate 5 was exchanged for concrete yards enclosed by fencing and guard towers. During his early years in custody, legal appeals followed a predictable course. Defense teams sought review of evidentiary rulings and forensic testimony. Such appeals are common in cases involving trace evidence. Courts examined whether fiber analysis had been properly presented and whether procedural safeguards had been upheld. Ultimately, the convictions stood as years passed. Kibbe's case faded from daily headlines. New investigations captured public attention. Advances in forensic science, particularly the expansion of DNA databases, reshaped criminal justice narratives nationwide. The I-5 Strangler became part of California's historical record rather than an ongoing story. Inside prison, routine defines existence. Morning counts interrupt sleep at designated hours. Work assignments or educational programs fill segments of the day. Meals are brief and structured. Recreation is limited. Even communication with family or outside contacts is subject to regulation. For inmates serving lengthy sentences, time becomes measured not by milestones, but by cycles of routine. Psychologists studying incarceration often observe that long-term inmates develop coping mechanisms centered around predictability. Structure can be both constraining and stabilizing. For someone previously characterized by rigid habits, prison's imposed order may create an unexpected familiarity, though without the autonomy that once accompanied it. Public records indicate that Kibbe remained incarcerated for decades following his conviction. There were no widely publicized incidents of disciplinary notoriety during much of that period. Like many inmates serving life sentences, he became part of the background population, present but not prominent in media discourse. Meanwhile, Interstate 5 continued its transformation into an ordinary thoroughfare once again. Communities along the corridor rebuilt their sense of normalcy. The memory of the I-5 Strangler lingered primarily in documentaries, archival news segments, and law enforcement case studies. Yet prison systems are dynamic environments. Inmates age, health declines, social hierarchies shift, and occasionally, long dormant cases re-enter public awareness due to unexpected events. Kibby's name would resurface decades later under circumstances unrelated to the original crimes. But during the majority of his incarceration, life behind bars was defined by repetition. Repetition of routine, repetition of schedule, repetition of confined space. For investigators who had dedicated years to securing conviction, his imprisonment represented finality. The man once suspected of orchestrating controlled encounters along a vast highway network now operated within the strictest boundaries the state could impose. Control had inverted. The environment dictated the terms. Yet time, even within prison, continues moving forward. And as years accumulate, unexpected intersections between past and present can emerge. As the years passed, Roger Kibby's presence within the California prison system became less a headline and more a historical footnote. In the outside world, new cases captured attention. Forensic science evolved rapidly, with DNA technology reshaping investigations across the country. Younger generations grew up unaware of the fear once associated with the I-5 corridor. But inside prison walls, time moved differently. Long-term incarceration produces a kind of suspended existence. Days follow identical rhythms. Morning counts, structured meals, limited recreation, institutional work assignments, conversations that revolve around memory rather than future. For inmates serving effectively life sentences, the concept of long-term planning narrows to small increments, months, perhaps years, but rarely beyond. Psychologists studying long-term offenders often note the gradual fading of external identity. A person once defined by profession, community role, or public notoriety becomes defined instead by institutional classification. Kibbe, once a business owner in Sacramento, became simply another inmate in a controlled environment. During his incarceration, he reportedly maintained a low public profile. Unlike some high-profile offenders who pursue media interviews or public correspondence, there were no widely circulated interviews that dramatically reshaped public perception. His case remained rooted in the court record rather than ongoing public narrative. Over time, aging inmates face a different kind of reckoning. Physical health changes. Energy diminishes. The external world evolves technologically and socially in ways that incarcerated individuals rarely witness firsthand. The highways, cities, and communities they once knew transform beyond recognition. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies periodically revisited unresolved elements of the I-5 cases. In some serial investigations, convicted offenders later provide additional admissions or clarifications regarding earlier crimes. Public records indicate that Kibbe eventually acknowledged involvement in multiple offenses beyond those initially proven in court, though such admissions did not dramatically alter his sentence. The life term remained in place. For families of victims, the knowledge that he remained incarcerated provided a degree of stability. The case had reached legal closure, even if emotional closure remained complex. Then, in 2019, decades after his conviction, Kibbe's name returned to headlines under unexpected circumstances. That on December 1st, 2019, Roger Kibbe was killed inside Mule Creek State Prison in California. Reports indicated that he was attacked by a fellow inmate. The assailant, also serving a lengthy sentence for violent crimes, allegedly strangled Kibbe within his cell. The irony of the method was not lost on media outlets. The man once known publicly as the I-5 Strangler had died in prison by the same means associated with his crimes. Authorities confirmed his death following investigation, and the incident closed the final chapter of his life. For observers, the event carried a sense of abrupt finality. After decades of incarceration, his story ended not through illness or quiet passing, but through violence within the confines of prison, a reminder that institutional environments carry their own risks and hierarchies. From a documentary perspective, his death marked the end of a narrative arc that began along a highway corridor in the late 1970s. The man who once exploited transitional spaces had ultimately spent more than 3 decades confined within rigid structure. Control, which had defined the psychological analysis of his case, had long since evaporated. Interstate 5 continues to carry travelers north and south each day. Most drivers are unaware of the history that once shadowed its stretches. Sacramento has grown, changed, and modernized. The upholstery shop that once served as investigative focal point exists only in records and memory. What remains is the case itself, a study in patience, forensic persistence, and the importance of collaboration across jurisdictions. The I-5 Strangler investigation demonstrated that even organized, mobile offenders leave traces. It showed that microscopic fibers can unravel years of concealment. It underscored the power of survivor testimony and interagency coordination. Roger Kibbe's life ended in 2019 within prison walls, closing a chapter that had begun 4 decades earlier along a quiet stretch of highway. The road moves forward, the system endures, and history, once shadowed, settles into record. Chapter 11: The 2019 Prison Killing. By 2019, Roger Kibbe had been incarcerated for nearly 3 decades. The urgency that once surrounded his name had long faded from daily news cycles. To many, the I-5 Strangler was a case from another era, one studied in criminal justice classrooms, revisited in documentaries, and remembered by families whose lives had been permanently altered. Inside prison walls, however, time does not erase identity entirely. Reputations linger, histories circulate, and hierarchies shape daily life. On December 1st, 2019, that long arc of incarceration came to an abrupt end. Kibbe was housed at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, a facility that houses inmates serving lengthy and often violent sentences. Like many state prisons, Mule Creek operates under strict schedules and surveillance, but it is also a living environment populated by individuals with complex histories. Among them was Harry Harris, a fellow inmate convicted of multiple violent crimes. According to official reports, Harris attacked Kibbe inside his cell. The method was consistent with manual strangulation. Correctional officers responded, but Kibbe was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. He was 80 years old. The incident immediately generated renewed media attention. Headlines noted the stark irony. The man known as the I-5 Strangler had himself died by strangulation. For families and observers, the news felt surreal. A final twist in a case already marked by layers of darkness. Prison violence, while not constant, is a recognized reality within correctional systems. Inmates serving long sentences for violent offenses often carry reputations that shape their interactions with others. Social dynamics inside prison can be influenced by notoriety, perceived vulnerability, gang affiliation, and personal grievances. In Kibbe's case, reports indicated that his attacker later confessed to the killing. Harris allegedly told authorities that he had targeted Kibbe deliberately. Public court documents suggested that Harris sought to gain notoriety or possibly leverage his own situation through the act. Such motivations are not uncommon in prison settings, where attention and status can hold distorted value. The killing prompted internal investigation by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. As with any in-custody death, Procedures required review of security footage, staff response times, and housing assignments. Questions emerged about how the attack had unfolded within a monitored environment. Prison officials maintained that immediate medical assistance had been provided, though the injuries proved fatal. For observers, the event carried symbolic weight. Roger Kibbe had spent decades confined under state supervision, his freedom permanently revoked. His life was structured by institutional routine. Yet, even within that controlled environment, violence remained possible. The rigid schedules and monitored corridors did not eliminate risk entirely. The psychological contrast was striking that a man once analyzed for his need for control had died in a setting where control belonged exclusively to the institution. And yet, even there, unpredictability prevailed. Media outlets revisited his crimes in retrospective coverage, reintroducing the public to the I-5 corridor cases of the 1970s and 1980s. For younger audiences unfamiliar with the name, the prison killing served as entry point into a decades-old investigation. Documentaries and true crime programs re-examined the forensic breakthroughs and survivor testimony that had secured his conviction. For families of victims, reactions were complex. Some expressed indifference, noting that Kibbe had already been serving life without parole. Others viewed the development as an unexpected closing chapter. Public statements varied, reflecting the deeply personal nature of grief and justice. Legally, Kibbe's death ended any remaining appeals or proceedings associated with his case. The narrative arc that began along Interstate 5 concluded within prison walls. His attacker, Harris, was subsequently charged with homicide related to the prison killing. The incident also prompted broader discussion about aging inmates within the prison system. At 80 years old, Kibbe was part of a growing demographic of elderly prisoners serving life sentences. Correctional institutions face increasing challenges related to health care, housing, and safety for aging populations. The intersection of notoriety and vulnerability can create complex dynamics among inmates. For decades, Interstate 5 had symbolized anonymity and mobility in the Kibbe case. His death, by contrast, occurred in confinement, in a space measured not in miles, but in square footage. The open road that once defined his criminal pattern was replaced by a locked cell shared with another inmate. History sometimes closes in unexpected ways. The I-5 Strangler's story, once centered on unanswered disappearances, ended with a final headline that carried its own stark irony. The highway continued to hum with traffic, indifferent to the events that had once shadowed its path. Inside Mule Creek State Prison, however, one chapter ended decisively on that December day in 2019. In the days following Roger Kibbe's death, Mule Creek State Prison returned to routine, as correctional facilities are designed to do. Incidents are investigated, reports are filed, and schedules resume. Yet outside the prison walls, the news reverberated in a different way. For many, the I-5 Strangler had long existed as a closed chapter, legally resolved, historically cataloged. His death reopened the narrative briefly, casting the final act of his life in stark and ironic contrast to the crimes that had defined him. Harry Harris, the inmate responsible for the attack, was already serving a lengthy sentence for violent offenses. Reports indicated that he had strangled Kibbe inside their shared cell. Authorities confirmed that Harris later admitted responsibility. Additional charges were filed, though given Harris's existing sentence, the legal consequences primarily reinforced confinement rather than altering his long-term status. The motive behind the killing drew public speculation. Some reports suggested that Harris sought notoriety, possibly believing that targeting a convicted serial offender would elevate his own status. In prison culture, notoriety can carry distorted currency. Inmates sometimes attach significance to high-profile acts, even when those acts result only in further incarceration. Correctional systems operate under layered security protocols, yet shared cell arrangements inherently involve risk. Housing decisions consider numerous factors: age, health, behavioral record, and classification level. Kibbe, at 80 years old, was among the aging population of inmates serving life sentences. His vulnerability due to age may have influenced housing placement, though official reviews focused primarily on procedural compliance. The killing prompted internal administrative review. Correctional authorities examined whether there had been warning signs or classification issues that could have prevented the attack. Such reviews are standard following in-custody deaths. While prison environments aim to maintain order, unpredictability remains an unavoidable element when housing individuals with histories of violence. For families connected to the original Interstate 5 cases, the event carried varied emotional resonance. Some expressed that Kibbe's death did not change the past or alter the justice already delivered through conviction. Others viewed the irony as a symbolic closure, a final note in a story that had once dominated years of uncertainty. Media retrospectives revisited the fiber evidence that had secured his conviction, the survivor testimony that guided investigators, and the collaborative efforts across jurisdictions that eventually unmasked the I-5 Strangler. Younger audiences, encountering the story for the first time through 2019 coverage, were introduced to a case emblematic of pre-DNA forensic persistence. The psychological themes that had framed earlier chapters, control, routine, compartmentalization, found a quiet counterpoint in the circumstances of his death. For decades, analysts described Kibbe as someone who orchestrated environments to his advantage. In prison, however, personal autonomy is minimal. The rigid schedule of institutional life leaves little room for self-directed authority. His final moments occurred not within a carefully constructed scenario, but within a system governed entirely by external control. The irony extended beyond method. Interstate 5 had once represented movement, miles traveled, geographic familiarity, calculated mobility. Mule Creek State Prison represented confinement, controlled corridors, limited square footage, and monitored interaction. The arc from open highway to shared cell marked a dramatic compression of space and autonomy. From a broader perspective, the 2019 killing underscored the reality that incarceration, while designed to impose safety and order, cannot eliminate risk entirely. Correctional institutions are complex social ecosystems. They house individuals with diverse backgrounds, psychological profiles, and histories of violence. Even within structured environments, personal conflict and notoriety-seeking behavior can erupt unexpectedly. Legally, Kibbe's death closed any remaining procedural avenues related to his own convictions. The narrative that began with quiet disappearances along Interstate 5 ended not with a scheduled passing, but with an abrupt act inside prison walls. His attacker faced prosecution for the homicide, ensuring that accountability extended into this final chapter as well. For California communities once unsettled by the I-5 Strangler, the news marked the end of a story that had spanned 4 decades. The highway corridor returned fully to its ordinary identity, a route of travel rather than a symbol of fear. History sometimes resolves itself not through dramatic public reckoning, but through quiet administrative conclusion. Roger Kibbe's life ended as it had been confined for years, under the jurisdiction of the state, within an institutional structure that defined his final decades. The I-5 Strangler's name now resides in archived case files, forensic textbooks, and documented histories of California crime. His death in 2019 did not erase the past, but it sealed it. Chapter 12: Legacy of the I-5 Strangler. When a serial case finally settles into history, what remains is rarely the sensational label. It is the investigative lessons, the forensic evolution, and the quiet imprint left on communities that once lived in uncertainty. The story of Roger Kibbe, known publicly as the I-5 Strangler, extends beyond conviction and prison death. It occupies a place in the broader development of modern criminal investigation. The late 1970s and 1980s represented a transitional era in forensic science. DNA profiling was not yet widely available. Digital databases linking counties did not exist. Communication between jurisdictions required deliberate coordination rather than automated alerts. Against that backdrop, the I-5 investigation stands as a case shaped by persistence rather than technology. One of its most enduring legacies lies in interagency collaboration. At the time of the disappearances, law enforcement agencies along Interstate 5 operated largely within county boundaries. Early cases were handled independently, with limited cross-referencing. As patterns emerged, detectives recognized that geography did not respect jurisdictional lines. The highway connected communities physically and, increasingly, criminally. The collaborative meetings that followed marked an early example of coordinated serial investigation across multiple counties. Files were shared. Evidence was compared collectively. Investigators from different departments began aligning timelines and mapping incidents together. This cooperation strengthened the case against Kibbe and set a precedent for future cross-jurisdictional efforts. The forensic dimension of the case also carries lasting significance. Fiber analysis, once considered a secondary tool, became central to conviction. The repeated recovery of upholstery-grade fibers demonstrated how trace evidence can accumulate into persuasive narrative. Although DNA now dominates forensic discourse, the Kibbe case reminds investigators that microscopic materials, when analyzed carefully and contextualized properly, remain powerful. Forensic science has evolved dramatically since the 1980s. Laboratories now integrate advanced spectroscopy, digital imaging, and DNA databases capable of linking cases instantly across states. Yet the foundational principle remains unchanged. Small details matter. The psychological profiling used in the investigation also contributed to its legacy. Analysts recognized patterns of organization, control, and mobility. These behavioral assessments guided surveillance and suspect narrowing without replacing physical evidence. The balance between psychology and tangible proof remains a cornerstone of modern serial investigations. Communities along Interstate 5 carry a quieter legacy. During the years of uncertainty, caution reshaped behavior. Hitchhiking declined sharply. Public awareness of personal safety increased. Media coverage highlighted vulnerabilities inherent in transitional environments, rest stops, on-ramps, isolated corridors. Though the immediate threat ended with Kibbe's arrest, the cultural memory of vulnerability along highways persisted. In Sacramento, the case challenged assumptions about what danger looks like. Roger Kibbe had been a business owner, a resident embedded within ordinary routines. His outward stability masked alleged criminal behavior spanning years. This duality reinforced a difficult truth. Organized offenders often appear indistinguishable from their surroundings. For families of victims, legacy is deeply personal. Courtroom conviction provided accountability, but memory extends beyond legal resolution. The I-5 case remains a reminder that behind investigative breakthroughs lie individual lives, people whose stories intersected with a calculated pattern. The endurance of their memory, rather than the notoriety of the offender, forms the most human dimension of legacy. The 2019 prison killing added an unexpected final layer. While his death did not alter prior convictions, it closed the timeline definitively. There would be no further appeals, no additional interviews decades later. The narrative arc, stretching from highway disappearances to prison confinement, reached conclusion. Interstate 5 continues to hum with traffic each day. Drivers cross county lines without considering the investigative milestones once tied to that corridor. Sacramento continues to expand and modernize. Upholstery shops still operate as ordinary businesses across the state, their tools and materials unremarkable in everyday context. Yet within law enforcement archives, the I-5 Strangler case endures as study material, an example of how persistence, collaboration, and attention to trace evidence can dismantle even carefully controlled criminal patterns. History does not erase itself. It settles into record, offering instruction for those who follow. The legacy of the I-5 Strangler is not merely one of crime, but of resolution, the steady, patient unraveling of a pattern once hidden in shadow. As decades pass, certain cases remain referenced not because of shock value, but because of what they reveal about systems, investigative systems, legal systems, and social awareness. The story of Roger Kibbe occupies that space in California's criminal history. It stands at the intersection of evolving forensic science, cross-jurisdictional coordination, and the psychological study of organized offenders. One of the most enduring lessons from the I-5 investigation is patience. The crimes associated with the corridor unfolded over years. Early disappearances did not immediately connect. Evidence was limited by the technology of the time. Yet investigators resisted the temptation to treat each case as permanently isolated. They revisited files. They re-examined physical evidence as laboratory capabilities improved. They recognized that patterns may remain invisible until viewed collectively. This incremental approach laid groundwork for modern task force models. Today, multi-agency task forces form quickly when patterns appear across county or state lines. Databases link cases automatically. Geographic profiling software can detect clustering in ways manual maps once attempted. The Kibbe investigation belongs to the generation that bridged manual coordination and emerging forensic refinement. Fiber evidence, central to the case, also serves as a reminder that even in an age dominated by DNA, trace materials retain value. Microscopic comparison disciplines, fibers, hairs, soil, glass, require careful contextualization. They are not singular identifiers. They are cumulative indicators. In the I-5 case, cumulative indicators proved decisive. The psychological dimension remains equally instructive. The concept of compartmentalization, the ability to maintain outward normalcy while concealing deviant behavior, has been studied extensively since the 1980s. Organized offenders often rely on routine and structure not merely for camouflage, but for self-regulation. The pattern along Interstate 5 suggested deliberate pacing, calculated geography, and repetition that reinforced internal control. Understanding such behavioral frameworks assists modern investigators in narrowing suspect pools without succumbing to speculation. For communities, the legacy is quieter but lasting. Highway safety awareness increased significantly in the decades following the I-5 cases. Public education campaigns emphasized caution in accepting rides from strangers. Rest stop security improved in many areas. Surveillance technology expanded gradually, reducing anonymity along major travel corridors. While no single case alone transforms policy, cumulative experiences shape public consciousness. The prison chapter, concluding in 2019 with Kibbe's death at Mule Creek State Prison, adds a final reflection on accountability and consequence. His decades behind bars ensured that the legal system maintained its response. His death, occurring within the institution designed to confine him, closed the personal narrative but did not alter the investigative achievements that preceded it. Time transforms notoriety into documentation. Today, the I-5 Strangler case is studied in forensic seminars, referenced in criminal justice curricula, and revisited in documentaries examining pre-DNA investigations. Its endurance lies less in the moniker and more in the methodical work that resolved it. Interstate 5 stretches the length of California as it always has, a corridor of commerce, migration, and routine travel. Most who drive its lanes carry no awareness of the pattern once traced along its edges. That is, perhaps, the final testament to resolution. The highway is no longer defined by fear. Sacramento continues forward as well, growing neighborhoods, evolving industries, everyday lives unfolding without connection to a decades-old investigation. The legacy of Roger Kibbe, the man once labeled the I-5 Strangler, rests not in spectacle, but in study. It reminds investigators that control can be undone by detail. It reminds communities that vigilance and collaboration matter. It demonstrates that even before modern technology, persistence and shared information could unravel years of concealment. History rarely offers tidy endings, but in this case, the arc, from disappearances along a darkened highway to convictions secured through microscopic threads to decades of confinement and an unexpected prison death, has settled into record. The road moves forward, the lessons remain.